Welcome back, Internet. Good morning. This is Jeremy Reads Aloud Self-Help Books. And on this stream, I read books for self-improvement. And the book I'm reading right now is called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. I encourage you to get the book yourself. There's the Amazon link in the description here where you can get the book yourself. We're on chapter 5, The King. And the subheading is The Shadow King, the Tyrant and the Weakling. Here we go. Though most of us have experienced some of this energy of the mature masculine in our lives, perhaps within ourselves in moments when we felt very well integrated, calm, and centered, and from time to time from our father, a kindly uncle or grandfather, a coworker, a boss, a teacher, a minister. Most of us also have to confess that overall we have experienced very little of the king energy in its fullness. We may have felt it in bits and pieces, but the sad fact is that this positive energy is disastrously lacking in the lives of most men. Mostly what we have experienced is what we are calling the Shadow King. As in the case of all the archetypes, the king displays an active, passive, bipolar shadow structure. We call the active pole of the Shadow King the tyrant, and the passive pole the weakling. We can see the tyrant acting in the Christian story of the birth of Jesus. Soon after the Christ child is born, King Herod discovers the fact that the infant has been born and is in the world that he, King Herod, controls. He sends his soldiers to Bethlehem, looking for the new king, the new life, to kill it. Because Jesus is a divine child, he gets away in time. But Herod's soldiers kill every male child left in the town. Whenever the new is born, the Herod within us and in our outer lives will attack. The tyrant hates, fears, and envies new life, because that new life, he senses, is a threat to his slim grasp on his own kingship. The tyrant king is not in the center and does not feel calm and generative. He is not creative, only destructive. If he were secure in his own generativity and in his own inner order, his self-structures, he would react with delight at the birth of new life in his realm. If Herod, page 64, if Herod had been such a man, he would have realized that the time had come for him to step aside so that the archetype could be embodied in the new king, Jesus Christ. Another biblical story, the story of Saul, has a similar theme. Saul is another mortal king who became possessed by the tyrant. His reaction to the newly anointed David is the same as Herod's to Jesus. He reacts with fear and rage and seeks to kill David, though the prophet Samuel has told Saul that Yahweh no longer wants him to be king, that is, to embody the king energy for the realm. Saul's ego has become identified with the king and refuses to relinquish the throne. Human tyrants are those in kingly positions, whether in the home, the office, the White House, or the Kremlin, who are identified with the king energy and fail to realize that they are not it. Another example from antiquity is that of the Roman Emperor Caligula. Although the previous emperors had held enormous power over the people and the Senate of Rome and, through their office, over the entire Mediterranean world, and although they had been turned into gods after their deaths, Caligula broke new ground when he declared himself a god while still on earth. The details of this of his madness and his abuse and sadism toward all those around him are fascinating. Robert Graves' book, I, Claudius, and the television series based on the book give a chilling account of the development of the Shadow King as tyrant in the person of Caligula. The tyrant exploits and abuses others. He is ruthless, merciless, without feeling when he is pursuing what he thinks is his own self-interest. His degradation of others knows no bounds. He hates all beauty, all innocence, all strength, all talent, all life energy. He does so because, as we've said, he lacks inner structure and he is afraid, terrified, really, of his own hidden weakness and his underlying lack of potency. It is the Shadow King as tyrant in the father who makes war on his sons and his daughters, joy and strength, their abilities and vitality. He fears their freshness, their newness of being, and the life force surging through them, and he seeks to kill it. He does this with open verbal assault and depreciation of their interests, hopes, and talents. Or he does it, alternatively, by ignoring their accomplishments, turning his. We're on page 65 for a quick break for an illustration here. And the description of the illustration of this king here. It says King Arthur, illustration by Trevor Stubley from the Book of Merlin by T.H. White, circa 1977, reproduced by permission of the University of Texas Press Austin. Moving on to page 66. Turning his, page 66. Turning his back on their disappointments and registering boredom and lack of interest when, for instance, they come home from school and present him with a piece of artwork or a good grade on a test. His attacks may not be limited to verbal or psychological abuse. They may include physical abuse. Spankings may turn into beatings, and there may be sexual assaults as well. The father possessed by the tyrant may sexually exploit his daughters or even his son's weakness and vulnerability. A young woman came for counseling because she was having a lot of trouble in her marriage. What she described soon after entering therapy was an invasion of her home by the tyrant king in this sexually malignant aspect. At about the age of 12, her father had left her, her mother, and her sister and moved in with another woman. That woman's husband had then moved in with him. This man never liked his new wife, quote unquote, and he was quick to spot his new stepdaughter's beauty and vulnerability. He began demanding that she sleep with him, at first just lying beside him in bed at night. Then he began demanding that she masturbate him so that he ejaculated into tissues that he kept by the bed. Eventually, he forced her to have sex with him on the threat that if she didn't, he would leave them and they would have nowhere to turn financially. The young woman's mother never made a move to stop this horrendous abuse of her daughter and busied herself in the mornings cleaning under the mattress where she soiled the soiled tissue from the night before they had been stuffed. Pardon. That's kind of a graphic description there, so this is not a kid's book, just in case you didn't know. In the story of King David and Bathsheba, Bathsheba was the wife of another man, Uriah the Hittite. One day, David was walking on the roof of his palace when he spotted Bathsheba bathing. He was so aroused by the sight that he sent for her and forced her to have sex with him. In theory, remember, all the women of the realm were the king's. but they belong to the archetype of the king, not to the mortal king. David unconsciously identified himself with the king energy and not only took Bathsheba, but also had her husband, Uriah, killed. Fortunately for the kingdom, David had a conscience in the form of Nathan the prophet, who came to him and indicted him. David, much to his credit, accepted the truth of the indictment and repented. Page 67. The tyrant king manifests in all of us at some time or another when we feel pushed to the limit, when we are exhausted, when we are getting inflated. But we can see it operating most of the time in certain personality configurations, most notably in the so-called narcissistic personality disorder. These people really feel that they are the center of the universe, although they aren't centered themselves, and that others exist to serve them. Instead of mirroring others, they insatiably seek mirroring from them. Instead of seeing others, they seek to be seen by them. We can also observe the tyrant king operating in certain ways of life, even in certain quote-unquote professions. The drug lords, the pimps, the mafia bosses are all examples. They exist to further their own status and what they think is their own well-being at the expense of others. But we see this same self-interest in societally sanctioned positions as well. An interviewer should enter into a dialogue with you about your experience, your training, your hopes for yourself, and the company you are seeking to serve. Instead, he spends the whole interview talking about himself and his achievements, his power, his salary, and the virtues of his company, and never asks you about yourself. Most people in corporate America today are not at all interested in the companies they work for. Many are just quote-unquote treading water, looking for a way out and up. Here we find the executives who are more interested in furthering their own careers than in being good stewards of the quote-unquote realms placed under their authority. There is no devotion or real loyalty to the company, only to themselves. This is the CEO who negotiates for his own financial benefit to sell his company, to see it dismembered and rendered impotent, who is willing to see his friends and loyal employees fired as excess baggage in the now popular quote-unquote leverage buyout. The man possessed by the tyrant is very sensitive to criticism, and though putting on a threatening front, will at the slightest remark feel weak and deflated. He won't show you this, however. What you will see, unless you know what to look for, is rage. But under the rage is a sense of worthlessness, of vulnerability and weakness. For behind the tyrant lies the other pole of the king's bipolar shadow system, the weakling. If he can't be identified with the king energy, he feels he is nothing. Page 68. Pardon me, I'll just sip on a coffee here for a quick few seconds. That's good stuff. Page 68. Moving on. The hidden presence of his passive pole explains the hunger for mirroring, for quote-unquote adore me, quote-unquote worship me, quote-unquote see how important I am, that we feel from so many of our superiors and friends. This explains their angry outbursts and their attacks on those they see as weak. That is, those upon whom they project their own inner weakling. General Patton, for all his virtues, evidently had an underlying fear of his own weakness and cowardice. In the movie Patton, this is shown when he is visiting a field hospital during World War II. He's going from bed to bed, congratulating wounded men and giving them medals, something the king in his fullness does. But then he comes to the bed of a man who is suffering from quote-unquote shell shock. Patton asks him what his problem is, and the soldier tells him his nerves are shot. Instead of reacting with the compassion of the life-giving king who knows what his men are up against, pardon me, moving on. Instead of reacting with the compassion of the life-giving king who knows what his men are up against, Patton flies into a rage and slaps the soldier across the face, calls him a coward, humiliates and abuses him, and sends him from the hospital to the front lines. Though he does not know it, what he has seen is the face of his own hidden fear, a weakness projected onto another. He has glimpsed the weakling within. The man possessed by the weakling lacks centeredness, calmness, and security within himself. And this also leads him into paranoia. Pardon me. We see this in Herod, Saul, and Caligula, as all of them, unable to sleep at night, pace the palace, tormented by fears of disloyalty from their subordinates, in Saul's case, even from his children, and disapproval from God, the true king. The man possessed by the bipolar shadow king has much to fear. In fact, because his oppressive behaviors, often including cruelty, beg for an in-kind response from others. We laugh at the saying, quote unquote, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. They may be. A defensive, hostile, quote unquote, get them before they get you paranoia is destructive of one's own sense of calmness and orderliness. That works to destroy one's own character and that of others, and invites retaliation. A minister entered analysis a short time after a crisis has started in his church. A group of ne'er-do-well dissidents, a band of psychological and spiritual outlaws, had formed, and for their own envious reasons, they had set out to destroy this minister. The leader was a man who heard God talking to him audibly in the night and who had received page 69, received a dream that told him the minister was planning to kill him for working against him. Paranoia is catching. The paranoid instigator of this quote-unquote palace coup so harassed the pastor day and night with phone calls, hate letters containing outright threats, outbursts in the middle of these sermons, and speeches at church meetings, listing the minister's supposed failures, that the minister, not consolidated in his relationship to his own king energy, gradually slipped under the power of the tyrant / weakling. He became increasingly tyrannical and dictatorial about church policy, arrogated more and more power to himself in church governance, and began to use shady tactics against his quote-unquote enemies in order to drive them out of the church. At the same time, he was disturbed by terrifying nightmares that, night after night, revealed to him his own underlying fears and weaknesses. Mutual paranoia raised its dark bloom, and both the minister and the congregation ended in a world of confusion and subterfuge, a world utterly removed from the spiritual values the minister had sought so lovingly to teach. Another victory for the Shadow King. We can readily see the tyrant's relationship to the high chair tyrant, arising as he does out of this infantile pattern. Grandiosity is normal, in a certain way, in the divine child. It is appropriate for the divine child, like the baby Jesus, to want and need to be adored, even by kings. What parents need to do, and this is very difficult, is give the divine child in their own child just the right amount of adoration and affirmation so that they can let their human child down off the quote-unquote high chair easily, gradually into the real world, where gods cannot live as mortal humans. The parents need to help their human baby boy learn gradually not to identify with the divine child. The boy may resist being dethroned, but the parents must persevere, both affirming him and taking him down a peg at a time. If they adore him so much and don't help the baby boy's ego from outside the archetype, then he may never get down from his high chair. Inflated with the power of the high chair tyrant, he will simply cross into adulthood thinking he is quote-unquote Caesar. If we challenge a person like this and say to him, quote-unquote, "My God, you think you're Caesar," he may very well say, "Yeah, what about it?" This is one way the Shadow King is formed in men. Page 70. Nearing the end of the subheading. Page 70 of King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. Chapter 5, the King. We're reading the final part of the subheading, the Shadow King and the Weakling. The other way the Shadow King is formed is when the parents have abused the baby boy and attacked his grandiosity and gloriousness from the beginning. The grandiosity of the divine child / high chair tyrant then gets split off and dropped into the boy's unconscious for safekeeping. The boy may, as a consequence, come under the power of the weakling prince. Later, when he is an quote-unquote adult and functioning primarily under the dominance of the weakling, under the enormous pressures of the adult world, his repressed grandiosity may explode to the surface, completely raw and primitive, completely unmodulated and very powerful. This is a man who seemed cool-headed and rational and quote-unquote nice, but who, once he's been promoted, suddenly becomes quote-unquote a different person, a little Hitler. This is the man for whom the saying, quote-unquote, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, is entirely accurate. We'll take a break here on page 70 of the book King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. We're reading the chapter 5, the King. We just finished reading about the Shadow King and the Weakling Prince. And tune in next video in our day. I'll be reading page 70, the subheading, Accessing the King. This is the book, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette. I encourage you to get the book yourself. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I would appreciate some feedback. If you have any questions or concerns about this book, feel free to ask some questions. I'll answer the best of my ability. And I encourage you to get the book yourself. Click the Amazon link below to purchase the book yourself and add it to your cherished books on psychology and self-improvement. This is Jeremy Reads Aloud, Self-Help Books. Don't forget to leave a like. Thank you for watching, folks. Have a transformative week. Young men, awaken the king within. Take care of yourself. Bye.